In a crowded DMV, 80-year-old Marine veteran George Langley faces mockery for his trembling hands and slow pace. Struggling with paperwork, he drops his silver star, a medal earned for saving lives in Vietnam. The room falls silent as the medal's significance dawns. David Thompson, a DMV employee, recognizes George as the hero who saved his father's life in 1968. As David shares George's story, the crowd's disdain turns to awe. What happens next? Will this moment change the community forever, or will George's quiet heroism fade back into obscurity? Honor silent heroes like George Langley by sharing their tales. Join our mission to celebrate valor and dignity. Hit subscribe, share this story, and never let service be forgotten. Find the hero in your community. Be their voice today. In the bustling chaos of the DMV waiting room, a sharp voice sliced through the hum of impatience. "Move aside, old man. Let other people get their business done." The words, brash and cutting, came from a young man, his tone dripping with frustration as he stood in line, arms crossed, radiating the arrogance of youth. Every head in the room swiveled, eyes locking onto the target of his scorn. An elderly man, his shoulders stooped with the weight of years, his trembling hands clutching a stack of paperwork. The room fell into an uneasy hush. No one dared to intervene. Gazes flickered, some curious, some embarrassed, before darting away, leaving the old man to fumble alone as a few papers slipped from his grasp and fluttered to the floor. His fingers, gnarled by arthritis and time, reached down slowly, each movement a quiet battle against his body's betrayal. Then a soft clink broke the silence. A glint of silver slid from his pocket, hitting the tile with a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should. Light caught the object, sending a fleeting shimmer across the ceiling. The room froze. Every person, from the restless teens to the harried mothers, stopped breathing for a moment, their eyes fixed on the small, gleaming piece of metal. It was no ordinary trinket. It was a symbol, heavy with meaning, that demanded reverence. A silver star. This was George Langley, an 80-year-old United States Marine Corps veteran, a man whose unassuming frame belied a life forged in the crucible of war. George had survived the brutal urban combat of Hue City in 1968, a battle that remained a footnote in history books, but had reshaped the trajectory of the Vietnam War. For 3 days, he had crawled through a hail of bullets and shrapnel, dragging wounded comrades to safety, refusing to abandon a single soul. 7 men owed their lives to his courage, to his stubborn resolve to leave no one behind. The silver star, now lying exposed on the DMV floor, was a testament to those days of unrelenting heroism, days that still haunted his dreams with the screams of the fallen and the weight of those he couldn't save. George lived alone in a modest suburban home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where neighbors nodded politely but kept to themselves. The silence of his days was broken only by the rustle of the morning newspaper, the soft crunch of soil as he tended his small garden, or the familiar creak of the library's wooden chairs where he lost himself in worn books. His wife, Margaret, had been his anchor, his confidant, the one person who truly understood the depths of his heart. But 3 years ago, cancer had stolen her away, leaving George to navigate a world that felt emptier without her gentle presence. His children, grown and scattered across distant cities, had their own families, their own lives. They called when they could, but the distance, both physical and emotional, left George with only his memories for company. His living room was a quiet shrine to a life unspoken. In one corner, a triangular display case held a meticulously folded American flag, its edges crisp despite the years. Beside it, a few faded photographs captured young Marines frozen in time, grinning, defiant, forever young. A simple wooden box sat nearby, its lid rarely lifted, containing medals that carried the weight of sacrifice. Among them was the silver star, a relic of those 3 days in Hue when George had defied death to save others. He didn't open the box often. The memories were too heavy, too raw. On his nightstand stood a single photo of his squad, their faces full of life and camaraderie. Scrawled on the back in faded ink were the words, "Don't let anyone be forgotten." They wears the last words of his best friend, Tommy Rodriguez, spoken moments before a landmine outside Hue claimed his life. Those words had become George's creed, a promise he carried in his heart and honored in ways both grand and small. For decades, George had quietly dedicated himself to helping younger veterans. He guided them through the labyrinth of the VA system, helped them find arms, and offered a steady hand to those struggling to adjust to civilian life. He never sought praise or recognition. He simply showed up, driven by the memory of Tommy and the others who never came home. To George, service wasn't a chapter that closed with the war. It was a lifelong vow. But at 80, the world seemed determined to render him invisible. Checkout clerks barely noticed him, their eyes skimming over his weathered face. Waitresses rushed in, their smiles reserved for younger, louder patrons. To the young, George was just an old man, taking up space in a world that worshipped speed and youth. Yet he remembered a time when being a Marine meant something sacred, when sacrifice was revered, when leave no man behind was a code etched into the soul. That morning, George had woken with a familiar dread knotting his stomach. He was heading to the DMV to renew his driver's license, a task he approached with quiet resolve but no small amount of anxiety. His hands shook more than they used to, his reflexes dulled by age. He knew the whispers behind his back, the questioning glances that wondered if he should still be behind the wheel. But to George, driving was more than convenience. It was independence, the last bastion of a life he'd fought to maintain. He refused to burden his children, refused to admit that age was winning a war that bullets and shrapnel had failed to finish. In his jacket pocket, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, he carried his silver star. Not for show, George had never shown it to anyone but Margaret, but as a talisman, a reminder of the man he had been. The man who had faced death without flinching, who had kept his promises, who had carried his brothers to safety. It was his anchor on days like this, when the world seemed to forget that heroes didn't always wear capes or wield weapons. Sometimes they were just old men with canes, struggling to fill out forms with hands that no longer obeyed. As he shuffled through the DMV's crowded waiting room, George felt the weight of invisibility. The young man's harsh words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they echoed a truth he'd long accepted. The world had moved on, leaving him behind. He bent to retrieve his fallen papers, his knees protesting, his heart heavy with the ache of being dismissed. When the silver star slipped from his pocket, it wasn't just a piece of metal hitting the floor. It was a lifetime of sacrifice laid bare. In that moment, as the room fell silent, George felt the weight of every eye on him. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. But he didn't want their pity or their awe. He just wanted to renew his license, to hold on to the small dignity of independence that bureaucracy and time seemed determined to strip away. George Langley, the man who had saved lives under fire, now fought a quieter battle, one for respect, for remembrance, for the right to be seen. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room of the DMV, time seemed to stagnate, trapped in a haze of bureaucratic drudgery. The air was thick with the hum of overhead lights and the faint, restless tapping of feet against the linoleum floor. Rows of unforgiving plastic chairs cradled a restless crowd, each person simmering with impatience, their sighs and muttered complaints blending into a low, irritable hum. George, a man whose weathered face told stories his lips rarely shared, entered this scene with measured steps, his cane clicking softly against the floor. Each tap was a small act of defiance against the arthritis that gnawed at his joints, a reminder of a body that had endured decades of trials. He approached the check-in desk, where a young clerk, her eyes glued to her computer screen, barely acknowledged his presence. Without a glance, she slid a ticket toward him, number B47. George's gaze flicked to the digital display overhead, which coldly announced that A23 was currently being served. He sighed inwardly, resigned to the long wait ahead. Finding an empty chair near the back, George eased himself down, wincing as his knees protested the motion. The room around him buzzed with the restless energy of younger patrons, their fingers dancing across phone screens, their voices sharp with complaints about the sluggish pace. To them, the DMV was a personal affront, a theft of their precious time. George, however, was no stranger to waiting. He had spent hours in the backs of supply trucks, navigating treacherous roads under the shadow of enemy fire, his senses sharpened by necessity. But here, in this mundane purgatory, he felt the weight of his years more acutely. His hands, once steady enough to steer through chaos, now trembled with the quiet betrayal of Parkinson's, a secret he guarded fiercely from his family, unwilling to burden them with his frailty. As the minutes dragged into an hour, then two, George's hands shook more noticeably, the tremors making it nearly impossible to complete the paperwork clutched in his lap. The pen felt like a foreign object, slipping between fingers that refused to obey. He focused intently, willing his hands to steady, but the effort only deepened the frustration gnawing at him. Around him, the room's impatience began to take aim. A man in his 30s, his face twisted with irritation, muttered loudly enough for George to hear, "Jesus, how long is this going to take?" His eyes flicked toward George, his voice dripping with disdain. Some people shouldn't even be driving anymore. A woman nearby, flanked by two teenagers, let out a sharp laugh. Seriously, there should be an age limit. Look at him, probably can't even see the road. The words landed like shrapnel, each one cutting deeper than the last. George kept his eyes on his paperwork, his jaw tightening as he fought to block out the cruelty. These strangers knew nothing of the man he had been, the Marine who had driven through enemy territory with nothing but a map and his instincts, who had navigated by starlight when technology failed, who had faced death with a steady hand and a clear mind. They saw only an old man, slow and trembling, an obstacle in their hurried lives. The weight of their judgment pressed against his chest, stirring a quiet ache of shame he hadn't felt in years. When the digital display finally flashed B47, George rose with deliberate care, his cane steadying him as he made his way to window 6. The clerk, a young woman whose face barely hid her impatience, didn't bother to look up. "ID and paperwork," she said flatly, her voice carrying the monotony of routine. George reached for his wallet, but his trembling hands betrayed him. The wallet slipped, and as he fumbled to retrieve his ID, papers fluttered to the floor like fallen leaves. The clerk's voice cut through the air, loud and sharp. "Sir, you need to have your documents organized. This isn't that complicated." Her words echoed in the room, drawing the attention of the waiting crowd. George's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and frustration burning beneath his skin. He bent to gather his papers, his knees screaming in protest, each movement a small battle against his aging body. The room's patience, already thin, unraveled further. "Come on, Grandpa," a voice called from the crowd. "We don't have all day." Another chimed in. "Maybe it's time to hang up the keys." The comments grew bolder, more cutting. "This is ridiculous. There should be a separate line for people who can't handle basic tasks." The man in his 30s, emboldened by the crowd's murmurs, pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is why our DMV takes forever," he announced, his voice smug as he addressed his social media followers. "Old people who can't function, holding up the line." Laughter rippled through the room, a cruel chorus that made George's ears burn. He tried to stand straighter, to reclaim some shred of dignity, but his hands shook violently now, and his paperwork slipped to the floor again. The weight of their scorn was suffocating. George, who had once carried wounded comrades to safety under a hail of bullets, who had driven through ambushes with nerves of steel, felt reduced to nothing more than a spectacle. The laughter, the sneers, the impatient sighs, they stripped away the armor he had worn for decades, leaving him exposed and raw. The woman with the teenagers spoke up again, her voice dripping with exasperation. "Oh, for God's sake, can someone please help him so we can all get out of here?" But no one moved. They watched, some with amusement, others with thinly veiled annoyance, all of them treating George like an inconvenience rather than a man with a lifetime of courage behind him. The clerk at window 6 let out a dramatic sigh, her impatience now a performance for the crowd. "Sir, if you can't manage your paperwork, maybe you should come back when someone can help you." The words hit like a final blow, sharp and humiliating. George froze, his heart heavy with a mix of anger and shame. He was no stranger to hardship. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, had carried the weight of his country's trust through unimaginable danger. Yet here, in this fluorescent lit room, he was dismissed as a confused old man, his worth measured only by the speed of his hands and the clarity of his movements. As he knelt to retrieve his papers once more, his mind churned with memories of a life these strangers would never understand, a life of sacrifice and resilience now buried beneath their careless judgment. The old man's trembling hands scrambled across the cold, grimy linoleum of the DMV floor, chasing after the scattered papers that had slipped from his grasp. Each flutter of a page felt like a piece of his dignity disintegrating, crumbling under the weight of the snickers and stifled laughter from the crowd around him. George Langley's weathered face burned with a quiet shame, though he tried to hide it behind the stoic mask he'd worn for decades. The ache in his knees from kneeling only deepened the sting of being the center of unwanted attention. As he reached for his driver's license, his worn jacket shifted, and something small and silver tumbled from his pocket. The object struck the floor with a sharp metallic clink, a sound that sliced through the hum of the waiting room, freezing time for a heartbeat. The silver star lay there, its vibrant ribbon a stark contrast against the dull gray linoleum. Its 5 points gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting a brilliance that seemed almost defiant, as if it refused to be ignored. For a moment, the world stopped. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The young man in the corner, who had been recording the old man's fumble with a smirk, lowered his phone, his expression shifting from amusement to uncertainty. The woman in line, who had been loudly complaining about the wait while her teenage daughter scrolled mindlessly on her phone, fell silent, her irritation replaced by a flicker of curiosity. Even the clerk at window 6, who had been glued to her computer screen with robotic indifference, glanced up, her eyes narrowing as they landed on the metal. In that small, shining star, the room saw something unexpected, a glimpse of a truth they hadn't anticipated. It was as if the metal carried a weight far greater than its size, a story that demanded respect and rewrote the narrative of the frail old man they'd been mocking. George, still on his knees, stared at the star, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and pride. He hadn't meant for it to fall, hadn't wanted to draw attention to it. That metal was a private piece of his past, a relic of a life he rarely spoke about, even to those closest to him. Now it lay exposed, vulnerable to the judgment of strangers. Standing just behind George in line was David Thompson, a DMV employee on his lunch break. Unlike the others, David's reaction was immediate, visceral, his breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto the silver star. He knew exactly what it was. His father, a Marine who had served in Vietnam, had spent countless evenings sharing stories of the war, his voice thick with reverence as he described medals just like this one. David could still picture his father's calloused hands holding up a photograph of a similar star, its ribbon faded, but its significance undimmed. And among those stories, one name had always stood out: George Langley, the Marine who had saved his father's life during the Battle of Hue City in 1968. A man who had risked everything, crawling through a minefield under enemy fire to drag a wounded comrade to safety. A man who had been recommended for the Medal of Honor but received the Silver Star instead. A hero who had never sought the spotlight. David's heart raced as he stared at the old man on the floor. Could it really be him? The hero from his father's stories. The man whose courage had given David's father a chance to live, to build a family, to tell his son about the Marine who refused to leave anyone behind. The coincidence felt impossible, almost divine. David's father, James Thompson, had spoken of George Langley with a gratitude that bordered on worship, his eyes misting over as he recounted the half-mile trek through enemy territory, George carrying him despite the bullets whizzing past. And now here was George Langley, not in a photograph or a memory, but in the flesh, kneeling on a dirty DMV floor, mocked by people who couldn't begin to understand the weight of his sacrifice. The silence in the room stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. David took a step forward, his voice steady but laced with emotion, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Sir," he said, his words clear and deliberate, "are you George Langley?" The question hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, like a prayer waiting for an answer. Every eye in the room turned to the old man, who looked up from the floor, his weathered face etched with confusion and a trace of wariness. How could this young man, a stranger, know his name? George's voice, when it came, was soft and almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to claim the identity being offered. "Yes," he said quietly, "I'm George Langley." David felt his breath catch, his chest tightening with a flood of emotions, gratitude, awe, and a profound sense of destiny. For 38 years, his father's stories had painted George as larger than life, a figure of almost mythic heroism. To meet him now in such an ordinary place under such humbling circumstances felt surreal. "Sir," David said, his voice growing stronger, trembling with the weight of what he needed to say. "My father was James Thompson, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Hue City, 1968. George's eyes widened, a spark of recognition flickering in their depths. "Jimmy Thompson?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "The kid from Ohio?" David nodded, his throat tight as tears began to well in his eyes. "That's him," he said softly. "He never stopped talking about you. He told me how you crawled through a minefield to pull him out of a collapsed building, how you carried him half a mile while the NVA was shooting at you. He said you saved his life." The DMV waiting room, once buzzing with impatience and indifference, had fallen into a profound silence. Every phone was lowered, every whispered conversation stilled. The air felt charged, as if the space had transformed into a sacred ground where something extraordinary was unfolding. George, with David's gentle assistance, rose slowly to his feet, his body frail but his presence commanding. The years had taken their toll, but in that moment, the Marine who had faced death without flinching stood tall once more. "How's Jimmy?" George asked, his voice soft but urgent, as if he could still picture the young Marine he'd carried to safety all those years ago. David's face fell, his eyes glistening. "He passed away 2 years ago," he said quietly. "Cancer. But before he died, he made me promise something." David's voice grew louder, dressing not just George but the entire room, as if he needed everyone to bear witness to this moment. "He made me promise that if I ever met Sergeant George Langley, I would tell him that James Thompson lived 73 good years because of what you did. He had 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and a life full of love, all because you refused to leave him behind." The silence that followed was deafening, a collective holding of breath as the weight of David's words settled over the room. David knelt down, his movements careful and deliberate, and picked up the silver star from the floor. He held it with reverence, as if it were a holy relic, its ribbon catching the light as he stood. Turning to the crowd, he held the medal aloft, his voice steady but resonant with pride. "This," he said, addressing the silent onlookers, "is a silver star. It's awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Only Marines who demonstrate extraordinary heroism under fire receive this honor." His gaze shifted to the young man who had been recording earlier, whose face now burned with shame. "The man you were just mocking," David continued, his voice unwavering, "is a hero. He risked his life so others could live, and he deserves our respect." The room remained still, the weight of the moment lingering as George stood quietly, his eyes fixed on the medal in David's hands. A lifetime of memories, both painful and proud, reflected in his gaze. The air in the DMV office hung heavy with the hum of impatience, the kind that settles into a crowd forced to wait too long. Amid the restless tapping of feet and the occasional sigh, a young man's voice cut through the monotony, sharp and mocking. He was filming, his phone aimed at an older man whose weathered hands fumbled slightly with his paperwork. The young man sneered, his words dripping with disdain as he muttered about old geezers who shouldn't be driving. His laughter was a shallow jab, meant to entertain his audience but blind to the weight of the life he was ridiculing. Sergeant George Langley sat quietly, his posture steady despite the slight tremble in his hands, a lingering echo of battles fought decades ago. The young man's words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they dismissed a lifetime of sacrifice in a single breath. George's mind drifted to the Battle of Hue City, where the air had been thick with smoke and the screams of the wounded. He could still feel the weight of carrying 7 Marines to safety, their blood staining his uniform, their lives hanging by the thread of his resolve. Each step through that hell had been driven by a simple creed: no one gets left behind. Now in this sterile office, he felt the ache of being unseen, reduced to a caricature by someone who'd never known the cost of courage. David, standing a few feet away, had been watching the scene unfold. His jaw tightened as the young man's taunts continued, each word a spark threatening to ignite his restraint. David's father had been one of those 7 Marines, a man who came home to raise a family because George had refused to let him die. The stories of Hue City were etched into David's heart, tales of a sergeant who moved through gunfire like it was rain, pulling men from the jaws of death. To see that same man mocked now, in a place as mundane as a DMV, stirred a fire in David's chest. He stepped forward, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of unshakable truth. "You're laughing at a man who saved 7 Marines in Hue City," David said, his words slicing through the room's restless hum. The young man froze, his phone still raised, but the smirk faded as David's gaze pinned him. 7 families got to hold their sons again because Sergeant Langley decided no one gets left behind. While you're here whining about a line, this man spent 3 days under enemy fire, dragging wounded men to safety. While you're worried about your schedule, he was earning the respect of everyone who knows what real sacrifice means. The young man's face drained of color, his phone slowly lowering as shame crept into his expression. He hadn't known. How could he? But the weight of his ignorance settled like a stone in his gut. He thought of the video he'd been recording, the cruel captions he'd planned to add for likes and shares. Now those same images felt like a betrayal, a cheap shot at a man whose life deserved reverence, not ridicule. Nearby, an elderly woman rose from her seat, her hands trembling, not from age but from emotion. Her eyes, clouded with years, locked onto George's. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "My husband was in Vietnam. He'd be ashamed of how we've treated you." Her words carried the weight of memory, of a time when she'd waited for letters from a war-torn jungle, praying her husband would come home. The thought that she'd stood in line with a hero and failed to see him filled her with a quiet grief. She wanted to say more, to tell George about the night she'd spent clutching her husband's dog tags. But all she could manage was a nod of respect. One by one, others began to stand. A middle-aged man who moments earlier had been glancing at his watch with barely concealed irritation approached George. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped with the realization of his own pettiness. "Sir, I'm sorry," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I've got no excuse for how I acted." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He thought of his own life, comfortable, predictable, and how he'd let impatience blind him to the quiet dignity of the man before him. A woman with 2 teenagers trailing behind her stepped forward, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She'd been short-tempered earlier, snapping at her kids to stop fidgeting while she scrolled through her phone. Now she saw her actions through a new lens, one that exposed her failures as a parent in that moment. "I'm teaching my kids all the wrong lessons," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, and I'm grateful for your service." Her children, wide-eyed and silent, watched their mother's vulnerability, sensing the weight of the moment. They didn't fully understand George's story, but they felt the shift in the room, the way his presence commanded something deeper than words. David turned to the clerk at window 6, who had been watching the scene in stunned silence, her hands frozen over her keyboard. "This man's been waiting 2 hours to renew his license," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's time we showed him the respect he's earned." The clerk, a woman in her 30s who'd seen countless faces pass through her window, felt a pang of guilt. She'd been efficient but detached, treating George like just another number in the queue. Now she saw him, a man who'd carried the weight of lives on his shoulders. "Sir, please come forward," she said, opening her window with a gesture that felt like an apology. "And I'm sorry, I had no idea." Her voice was soft, almost pleading, as if she could undo the hours George had spent waiting. George looked at her with gentle eyes, the kind that had seen too much to hold grudges. "You shouldn't need to know," he said quietly. "Everyone deserves dignity, no matter who they are or what they have done." His words weren't a rebuke but a reminder, a reflection of the values he'd carried through war and into this ordinary day. He thought of the men he'd saved, their faces flashing through his mind, and how he'd never asked for thanks, only that they live well, that they honor the chance that they'd been given. The young man with the phone approached George, his steps hesitant, his confidence shattered. "Sir, I recorded some awful things," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to delete that video and maybe make a new one about real heroes." He felt small, his bravado stripped away, but there was a flicker of hope in his chest, a chance to make things right. He thought of his followers, the faceless crowd he'd been chasing, and realized he'd rather tell a story that mattered. George's gaze softened, a faint smile touching his lips. "Son, we all mess up," he said. "What matters is what you do next." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who'd seen redemption forged in the hardest moments. He remembered his own mistakes, the times he'd doubted himself in the chaos of war, and how he'd learned to keep moving forward. The clerk processed George's renewal with a care she rarely showed, her hands moving quickly but deliberately. When she tried to waive the fee, insisting it was the least we can do, George accepted with a nod, though he didn't need the gesture. To him, the real payment was the shift in the room, the way people were looking at each other, really seeing each other, for the first time all day. As George prepared to leave, David spoke again, his voice ringing clear. "In a few minutes you'll all go back to your lives," he said, addressing the room. "But I hope you carry this moment with you. Heroes don't always look like you expect. Sometimes they're your grandfather, your neighbor, or the person sitting quietly in the corner." His eyes locked onto George's, and his voice grew softer, more personal. "Sergeant Langley, my father wanted me to tell you something else. He said what you did in Vietnam wasn't just about saving lives. You showed him what it meant to be a Marine, what it meant to serve something bigger than yourself." David stood at attention, his civilian salute crisp and heartfelt. "Thank you for bringing my father home." The words carried a son's gratitude, a debt that could never be repaid but would always be honored. George returned the salute, his hands steady now, the tremble gone. For the first time that day, he felt the weight of his past lift, replaced by a quiet pride. The room erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but a thunderous wave of awe and gratitude. People were on their feet, not out of obligation, but because they'd witnessed something rare. A glimpse of true heroism, standing humbly in their midst. As George walked toward the exit, every person he passed stood, their gestures a silent acknowledgement of his worth. The young man with the phone was filming again, but this time his lens captured respect, not ridicule. "That," he said into his camera, his voice steady with a conviction, "is what an American hero looks like." George paused at the door, turning back to the room. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and strong. "I didn't serve for recognition or thanks," he said. "I served because it was right. And if I had to do it again, I wouldn't change a thing." His eyes found David's, and he added, "Tell your father's grandchildren about him. Make sure they know the kind of man he was." The words were a charge, a call to carry forward the legacy of courage and sacrifice. As George stepped out of the DMV, his stride was a little firmer, his head a little higher. The dog tags in his pocket, once heavy with the ghosts of war, felt different now, like a badge of honor finally seen by others. Behind him, a room full of strangers stood changed, their impatience replaced by a shared moment of reverence. They'd seen a hero, and in doing so, they glimpsed something greater within themselves. The ripples of transformation that began in the cramped, fluorescent-lit waiting room of the DMV spread far beyond its beige walls, touching the entire community like a stone cast into a still pond, sending waves in every direction. By the next morning, the video posted by the young man, Tyler Chen, had exploded across the internet, but not in the way he'd originally planned. Instead of the mocking footage he'd intended to share, the clip showed a moment of profound respect. George Langley, an 80-year-old Marine Corps veteran, being honored for his quiet heroism. Shared thousands of times, the video carried captions that resonated deeply. "This is what an American hero looks like, and never judge a book by its cover." Each view seemed to chip away at the cynicism that had sparked the incident, replacing it with a renewed sense of reverence for those who serve. David Thompson couldn't shake the weight of what he'd witnessed. The encounter at the DMV had stirred something deep within him, a mix of gratitude and pride for the man who had saved his father's life decades ago. That afternoon, he found himself driving to the community library, a place he knew George frequented. In his hand was a small, carefully wrapped package, its edges worn from years of being treasured. Inside the library, the air smelled of old books and polished wood, and there was George, seated in his usual corner, engrossed in a tattered biography of Winston Churchill. His silver hair caught the soft light filtering through the window, and his weathered hands turned the pages with a gentleness that belied the strength they'd once wielded. When George looked up and saw David approaching, his face broke into a warm, unguarded smile, the kind that carried the weight of years survived and battles won. "I brought you something," David said, his voice catching slightly as he placed the package on the table. "It belonged to my father." George's hands, steady despite their age, unwrapped the gift with care, revealing a black and white photograph, its edges slightly yellowed but the image still sharp. Two young Marines stood side by side, arms slung around each other's shoulders, their faces alight with the camaraderie of youth. One was unmistakably a younger George, his jaw set but his eyes bright with hope. The other was Jimmy Thompson, David's late father. "Dad carried this his whole life," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "He said it was taken the day after you saved him in '68. He wanted you to have it." George's fingers traced the faces in the photo, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. For a moment, he was back in Vietnam, the humid air heavy with the promise of helicopters coming to whisk them to safety. "I remember this day," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "We were waiting for the choppers to take us back to base. Jimmy kept joking, saying he was going to name his first son after me." David's lips curved into a bittersweet smile. "He did. My middle name is George." Nearby, Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, had been quietly observing, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She approached their table, her steps purposeful but kind. "Mr. Langley," she said, her voice warm with admiration, "would you consider letting us create a small display here to honor local veterans? We'd love to start with your story." George blinked, caught off guard, his humility making him hesitate. But the sincerity in her eyes convinced him, and within a week, the library had transformed a corner near its entrance into the Langley Reading Corner. There, George's silver star gleamed under soft lighting, displayed alongside letters his father had written home during the war, photographs from Hue City, and a simple plaque that read, "For quiet heroes who never asked for recognition." Each item told a story of sacrifice, but it was George's presence, his quiet strength, that gave the display its heart. The incident at the DMV hadn't gone unnoticed by its manager, who was mortified that such disrespect had occurred under his watch. Determined to make amends, he introduced new policies to better serve elderly customers and veterans. Staff underwent sensitivity training, learning to see beyond the surface of those they served. A Veterans Assistance Program was established, offering streamlined services in a dedicated line for those who'd served. The changes were small but meaningful, a quiet acknowledgement that even a bureaucracy could learn to honor its heroes. Tyler Chen, the young man who had initially mocked George, felt the weight of his actions like a stone in his chest. The viral video had exposed not just George's heroism, but Tyler's own misjudgment, and the shame gnawed at him. He recorded a public apology, his voice trembling as he spoke to the camera, admitting his mistake. The video reached even more people than his first. But Tyler's transformation went deeper than words. He began volunteering at the local VA hospital, spending his weekends reading to veterans or helping them navigate the labyrinth of paperwork. "Meeting Mr. Langley changed everything for me," he said in a follow-up video, his eyes earnest. "I realized that every elderly person I passed might be someone who gave everything for my freedom. I was so wrong to judge him." Each visit to the VA was a step toward redemption, a way to honor the man who'd opened his eyes. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had been with her teenagers at the DMV, saw the incident as a chance to teach her children a lesson they'd carry for life. She brought them to the library to meet George, who welcomed them with the same quiet warmth he extended to everyone. As they sat around a small table, George shared stories of Vietnam, not just the battles, but the moments of humanity that defined them. He spoke of courage, of sacrifice, and of the importance of treating everyone with dignity, no matter their appearance. The most important battles, he told them, his voice steady but soft, are fought by ordinary people doing extraordinary things when no one's watching. Sarah watched her children's faces shift from boredom to awe, and she felt a quiet pride. She'd misjudged George too, and now she was determined to raise her kids to see the heroism hidden in plain sight. Even the DMV clerk, who had been curt with George, felt the sting of regret. Unable to shake the guilt, She penned a handwritten letter of apology, her words careful and sincere. She donated to a veterans organization in George's honor, a small gesture that felt like a step toward making things right. But the most profound change came from the community itself. Word of George's decades of quiet service, helping other veterans navigate benefits, visiting them in hospitals, or simply listening, spread like wildfire. Suddenly, George wasn't dining alone at his small kitchen table anymore. Every Tuesday evening, the library became a gathering place for Coffee with George, where former service members, young and old, came together. They shared stories of their own, offered support to newer veterans, and rebuilt the brotherhood George had missed since leaving the Marines. Laughter and quiet moments of understanding filled the room, a testament to the community George had unknowingly inspired. A local news station caught wind of the story, but they didn't focus on the DMV incident. Instead, they highlighted George's 50 years of selfless service, his visits to fellow veterans, his quiet acts of kindness, his refusal to seek recognition. The segment painted a portrait of a man who had lived his life for others, a hero not because of a single act in 1968, but because of the countless small choices he'd made since. As the camera panned across the Langley reading corner, George sat quietly, uncomfortable with the attention, but grateful for the chance to honor his brothers in arms. In his heart, he carried the memory of Jimmy, of Tommy Rodriguez, his late best friend lost in Vietnam, and of Margaret, his beloved wife, whose absence still ached. But now, surrounded by a community that saw him, truly saw him, he felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. The ripples from that day at the DMV had become a tide, lifting not just George, but everyone who'd been touched by his story. In a small, bustling Department of Motor Vehicles office, an elderly man named George Langley stood quietly, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a stack of paperwork. To the casual observer, he was just another senior citizen, moving a little slower, perhaps struggling with the modern world's demands. His steps were deliberate, his posture slightly stooped, and his eyes carried a quiet weight, as if they held stories too heavy for words. George wasn't there to demand attention or special treatment. He was simply trying to renew his license, navigating the mundane frustrations of bureaucracy with the same patience he'd carried through a lifetime of far greater challenges. But when a medal slipped from his pocket and clinked onto the linoleum floor, the room paused. That small, gleaming piece of metal, a symbol of valor from a war long past, changed everything. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a window into a life of sacrifice, courage, and unspoken heroism. George's heart sank as the medal hit the ground. For a moment he felt exposed, as though a private piece of his soul had been laid bare for strangers to judge. He'd never been one to flaunt his service. The memories of those days, of jungles thick with danger, of comrades lost, of moments when survival seemed impossible, lived quietly within him. He didn't wear his medals to boast. They were tucked away, like the pain and pride they represented, only brought out when necessity demanded. As he bent to retrieve it, his hands shaking not from age but from the weight of those memories, he wondered if anyone would even care. To George, the medal was a reminder of promises kept, to his country, to his fellow soldiers, to himself. It was a promise to carry on, to live humbly, to never ask for more than the dignity he'd earned. Around him, the room stirred. A young man named David Thompson, waiting in line with his own frustrations, caught sight of the medal and froze. He'd been impatient moments before, tapping his foot, annoyed at the slow pace of the elderly man ahead of him. But now, as he watched George struggle to pick up the medal, something shifted. David's mind raced with questions. What had this man seen? What had he endured to earn that small, shining emblem? Guilt crept in as he realized how quickly he'd judged George's slow movements as an inconvenience. David stepped forward, not out of pity, but out of a sudden, humbling recognition. He knelt to help George, his voice soft with respect as he handed the medal back. "Sir, is this yours?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. In that moment, David felt a pang of shame for every time he'd dismissed an older person as irrelevant, for every moment he'd let impatience win over kindness. The other people in the DMV began to notice. A woman in her 40s juggling grocery lists and a mental checklist of errands paused her scrolling phone to watch. She'd seen countless elderly people in her daily rush, always moving too slowly, always in her way. But now, as she saw the reverence in David's gesture, she felt a twinge of regret. How many times had she sighed at an older person's pace, never considering the weight of their past? Her mind wandered to her own grandfather, a quiet man who rarely spoke of his time in the service. Had she ever truly asked him about it? Had she ever honored the sacrifices he'd made? The sight of George standing a little taller as he accepted David's help stirred something in her. She wanted to be better, to see beyond the surface, to recognize the heroes hiding in plain sight. Across the room, a teenager slouched in a chair, earbuds in, barely glanced up from his phone. But even he couldn't ignore the shift in the air. The metal, the quiet exchange between George and David, it pierced through his indifference. He thought of his history classes, where wars were just chapters in a textbook, names and dates to memorize. But here was a living piece of history, a man who'd walked through fire and come out the other side, not asking for applause, just a chance to renew his license. The teenager felt a spark of curiosity, a desire to know more about the people who'd shaped the world he took for granted. He pulled out one earbud, listening as whispers of George's story began to ripple through the room. George, unaware of the eyes on him, felt a mix of gratitude and discomfort. He wasn't used to attention. For decades, he'd lived quietly, his heroism tucked away like the metal in his pocket. He thought of his old friend Carrie, whose photograph he'd carried through the war, a talisman of hope, a reminder of why he fought. Carrie was gone now, but the memory of her smile still warmed him. He'd kept that photo, not because he had to, but because it tethered him to a time when every day was a gamble, when survival was a gift. David's small act of kindness reminded George of the camaraderie he'd felt in those days, when strangers became brothers in the face of danger. He wanted to tell David that, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he offered a quiet, "Thank you," his voice steady despite the emotions swirling within. The truth George's story revealed was profound yet simple. Honor isn't about the medals you wear or the accolades you collect. It's about the promises you keep to your country, to your comrades, to the values you hold dear. George's life was a testament to that truth. He didn't need to shout about his bravery. It was woven into the fabric of his being, evident in his quiet resilience, his unassuming grace. The people in that DMV learned something vital that day. Heroes don't always look like the larger-than-life figures in movies. They're the elderly man fumbling with forms, the woman inching through the grocery aisle, the neighbor who never speaks of their past. These quiet heroes carry invisible medals, earned in places with names most can't pronounce, in moments that would make Hollywood's grandest scenes seem pale. Yet how often do we overlook them? How many George Langleys have we brushed past, dismissing their slow steps as a nuisance or each fun? How many times have we let impatience override compassion, choosing convenience over kindness? Society often whispers a dangerous lie, that worth is tied to productivity, that value fades with age, that respect must be re-earned daily rather than honored for a lifetime of service. But George's story shatters that lie. True honor doesn't dim with time. Heroism doesn't expire. The sacrifices of past generations demand our reverence, not our ridicule. David's father, who carried Carrie's photograph for 50 years, understood this. He held on to that image not out of obligation, but because it reminded him of the gratitude he owed to her, to George, to all who risked everything for his freedom. Their sacrifices created ripples of impact that spanned generations, touching lives they'd never know. Right now, across America, there are heroes like George. They sit in waiting rooms, stand in checkout lines, live quietly in neighborhoods. They carry stories of courage we may never fully grasp, tales of battles fought in distant lands, of lives saved and lost. They ask for nothing more than the basic dignity they've earned 1,000 times over. Yet too often we fail to see them. We rush past, caught in our own busy lives, blind to the weight of their past. But what if we paused? What if we looked closer, saw the trembling hands not as a sign of weakness, but as evidence of a life spent in service? What if we chose to honor them before it's too late? So here's the call to action. Be the David in your community. Seek out the George in your world. When you see someone struggling, offer a hand, not out of pity, but out of respect. When you encounter an elderly person, remember they might carry stories of valor beyond your imagination. Before you sigh at someone moving too slowly, consider they may have once run through gunfire to save lives. Before you dismiss someone as irrelevant, think of the relevance their sacrifices hold for the freedoms you enjoy today. Somewhere right now, a George Langley sits alone, wondering if anyone remembers what service truly means. Don't let them wonder. Don't let them sit alone. Honor them. Thank them. Remember them. Because freedom isn't free. It was paid for by people who look just like the ones we might be tempted to overlook. Type "remember" if you vow to never judge a veteran by their age again. Share this story if you believe quiet heroes deserve loud recognition. If you believe service should never be forgotten. Your mission is simple. Find the George in your life, be the David who sees them, and honor them before their story fades. Because dignity, like heroism, has no expiration date.